chapter 6 in the book. The recording has started. Thank you, Sue Ann. For those of you that were not able to be with us on Sunday, just want to read the affirmation. Standing, this is how we love our neighbor. Standing as Jesus does, with the outcast and oppressed, the denigrated and afflicted, seeking peace and justice with or without the support of others. So let me just start out by saying, did you have any questions about the affirmation, the chapter, even the sermon from last week? Any questions you had about our week experience here with this affirmation? So you're gonna leave it up to me. All right, good. Well, let me ask you this. On the front page, on the first page, 65 of the book, Eric, after he gives the advocate this, we affirm that, and we confess this. And I want to look at the last part of the part that says we confess. I want to ask you about a word that I'm coming to struggle with these days. It says we confess that we have moved away from this path when we have suggested that Christianity is concerned only with the spiritual in contrast to the material, or vice versa. We have moved further away when we have celebrated blessings given by God without also acknowledging responsibilities that come with blessing. Help me for a minute think about the word blessing. What would you count as the blessing in your life? Oh, isn't that sweet? First, he pointed at her, then she saw that and pointed back at you. So, yeah, that's very, all right. So your good health, relationships, what else? Food. I'm sorry.
We're not poor and on the street.
Money.
My new church.
Your new church. Yeah. Well, I'm glad I'm not here to shoot any of that down. Any other blessing?
It's a mixture.
Okay. A mixed blessing.
Well, when I read this and when I read what you're talking about, I think of how, for the most part here in our society, we have access to food pretty easily, but it comes at a cost of low labor, of migration labor. We do it intentionally. It's not what you call the $15 an hour. What do you call that? The
minimum wage.
We use migrant labor. We set up a system of it. And when that gets a little out of control, as migrants are now coming back and forth, we do the blaming thing. Blaming things on migrants, We've kind of paused this a little bit. So this is a dichotomy here. And this is what I got out of this chapter.
Yeah.
And this is what I'm bringing to this group today. It's just, I think a lot of things, we don't think maybe how easily it is to access food, but at what, not just what cost, but what is our responsibility to take care of those who bring us the food.
Right. Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's in a nutshell. That's what I'm struggling with the word blessing, right? Yes.
I think blessing is a bigger picture. I think of a blessing as something that helps us, is a gift from God, or something that helps us see how to serve God better, or be closer to God. I don't know how to explain it. So some things could be a blessing to me and not to you. And it doesn't have to be a thing. It could be a feeling or anything. It could be a blessing. It helps us learn more.
So maybe a sense of encouragement or a sense of relief or, something that can be very,
so
very
negative
personal.
things can be a blessing too, because it helps open our brain.
Sure.
So those are blessings.
That's great. Jan?
I got hung up on the word responsibilities. I have
Yeah.
that circle. That really struck out to me. What is our responsibility?
Right. The responsibilities that come with blessing. Right. What are you going to do?
Right.
Yeah. Shirley?
Beginnings. Beginnings.
Beginnings are a blessing. Because we haven't ruined them yet. But yeah. The fact that things can become new, that's huge.
Not everybody has the same beginning.
Right.
Sometimes endings are a blessing.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah, it's true. And there have been folks who in our relationships or churches or whatever who have passed after a very arduous ordeal. And we call it a blessing. And we need them. What else? How do you hear the word blessing? What does that mean to you?
It's kind of like giving grace when you give somebody a blessing.
Oh, giving someone a blessing. That's right. Yeah. Do you think anything really happens when you bless somebody?
You feel better.
Chris's family, you always say bless you when somebody sneezes. And that's fine. It's the old tradition that your spirit's coming out of your body, then suddenly comes back in, you almost died. So bless you. But I don't know about you all, but whenever I sneeze, it's always the first of at least 6. And each time she's like, bless you. Like, you don't have to say it. You don't have to say it every time. But yeah. I think we are, we're scientific in some really beautiful, meaningful ways, but we're also scientifically cynical in some ways, where we don't know that you can really make a difference in someone's life by blessing them. That it's just words, just air. But boy, I think that's a really powerful gesture, and a gift that each of us is able to share without running out. That's kind of a neat thing. That's another way of thinking about blessing. Good. Anybody else? What is it for? Yes.
I think it's a gift in the best sense of the word, a gift.
That's great. That's great. So I do want to circle back to the point that Cindy made, which is when we talk about blessings, and now I'm thinking about the more material things, whether it's a spouse or the money or the food or the comfort that we have. When we think about blessings in that respect, we are often, and I don't mean this critically, I just want it to be realistic, we're often responding to the immediate experience that we have with something. And we are rightly grateful for it. And we try to express that gratitude by calling it a blessing. Maybe just as a pattern of speech, but also maybe more thoughtfully, like, it's not that I deserved this. Even if I worked hard, there's a part of this that's a gift. And I have to receive it and acknowledge it as such. So typically when we talk about blessing, we're talking about the immediacy of the experience of the blessing and how we should respond to it. Cindy's comment invites us to go upstream a little bit to what it is that made that blessing possible for us, what it is that brought it to us. And I remember, as a child, we'd always say the blessing before we ate. And You know, if we were hungry, we'd always ask my mom to do it because she'd always say, "Thank you, Jesus, for the food." Amen. Yeah, we were done. If we weren't hungry, Dad would go on and on. But it wasn't until later in life that I'd heard someone add to the prayer, "Bless the hands that prepared." And that just put a different level over. This food didn't magically appear, that we don't have house elves, you know, that just fix it. There's somebody who worked on it. So bless the hands that prepared it. And then even later in life, I began to hear people going further upstream, you know, and then they'd start to pray on and on like my dad, you know, the farm worker, all of those who had a hand in bringing this from farm to table, and recognize that. And Cindy's comments inviting us to go even further to say that in that journey from farm to table, there's a lot of injustice that has happened historically and continues now. Now, we should be no less thankful for the food in front of us and still receive it with gratitude and thankful hearts. But it also makes us aware that there's a story here. It's not just God says, "Hey, I like you more than other people. Have some great food." Which is almost what you hear sometimes with blessings, like, you know, God loves me the most. And I don't think the sincere heart wants to say that. So thinking as Cindy's invited us to think about the legacy of the thing for which we're being grateful. It's very, very important. And I think, Jan, that's part of what Eric is talking about when acknowledging the responsibilities that come with blessing. Let me stop there before I move to my next thought about that. Does that make sense? Is there anything we need to say to flesh out that idea a little bit? Okay. I have, for the last few years, and this is deeply Mark specific person, I quit using the word blessing because I think too often it's used without any acknowledgement of that trail of tears that leads up to it, with the unjust backstory. And I think sometimes we try to baptize our greed by calling our things blessed. Right. This is very Mark specific. I'm telling you, I'm not declaring this in the world. I know that if I call something a blessing, I've said God did it, and I've almost avoided the responsibility of asking, where's my part in this trail that brought this food to my table? Now look, by not calling it a blessing doesn't mean I've suddenly made life better for farm workers. There's not a single farm worker that said, "Thank goodness Mark didn't call that a blessing." You know, so I'm not kidding myself. I didn't do anything. But I'm reorienting the way I think about it. That what leads to my abundance is part of a system where a lot of people don't get to share in the abundance. In fact, they're deprived. And so then the question becomes, okay, acknowledging that, then what do you do? That's the responsibility question. What do you do? And it seems to me that there are some provisional answers that we can give. And I find myself more and more thinking this way, that we can't fix the whole history of injustice the terms of trade in the global market, which significantly favors developed countries rather than poor countries. We can't fix all that. But there are some provisional things we can do that are a step in the right direction. We can shop locally, where exploitation becomes much less of a factor. You're supporting local businesses or local farms, something like that. It doesn't fix everything, but it is a small step in the right direction. And you know, on top of that, you can advocate, you can write letters, you can support farm workers, and you can do all those things. But in terms of what to do with this blessing, and we're thinking about the food on the table right now, is just become more aware of what food we're eating, who has a hand in it, how just or unjust is that process. If you buy fresh produce from a local farmer's market and cook and serve that, it's a radically different thing than if you buy something that's been processed in order that it can have a shelf life of 3 months or more, so that it can make its way from wherever it was originated to the warehouse, to the grocery store. And just that little change, that change of heart, it strikes me, a way of being responsible to the blessing. So I think Eric's language is allowing me to go back and reclaim the word blessing, as long as I do so with the word responsibility, always close by. Does that make sense? Your thoughts, what do you think? Blessing, are we doing what Lutherans do and take all the happy things and make them sad? Oh, blessing, you thought it was a good thing, you devil. I don't mean that. But what do you think? What's happening with regard to?
So what do you think if you say, I've said before, a blessing in your personal life, that something has changed your life? I've always said it was a real blessing from God that I got a job at Southern California College when it was set. I was a single mom at that time, hadn't worked in years. And I've always said it was a real personal blessing to me and my family, my children, that I was hired there at a Christian college. But I've always said, personally, it was a personal blessing for me. Is that? I
think you've said it perfectly. I mean, I do think you've said it perfectly, because as a woman and a mother, you have things to which you're responsible, and that job enabled you to meet those responsibilities.
And I've always said it was a real blessing, sure, for me, and to be around other Christian people at that time, because I was really kind of turned off to church at that time, yeah, because of the circumstances. That so I've always said that.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, that's a great point. It's like, I think you're saying it perfectly, in that you said personal blessing to me, and you can articulate the value that it brought to your life, and you're doing so in a way that you're not pretending you're God's favorite. You're actually saying this was a gift. Yeah, I think that's fine. I hope that what I've said prior to now doesn't imply don't ever say blessing again. I was struggling with it because of how I've heard people forget the backstory, and but I think you expressed that perfectly. Cindy?
Sometimes I hear people use the word "I'm blessed" as if they're saying I'm lucky. As
yeah.
No, again, without the backstory, but it's almost in place of.
Yeah.
As opposed to acknowledging all the people that helped make that come about with God's guidance.
Yeah.
That kind of process.
Yeah, you know, and I agree a lot. I don't think it's sometimes I think people are just not being very thoughtful. But there's a language challenge on what to call these things. And you can see that in the New Testament, and even more in the history of the New Testament. Think of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Jesus starts out with the 12 Beatitudes. Blessed are, blessed are, blessed are. And we never know whether you say blessed or blessed. You know, is that two syllables or what? But if you look at all the different translations, nobody's really quite sure how to translate the Greek term there. Just like I think the writers weren't really quite sure which term to use. What do you call this thing? So you have blessed in some translations. You have happy in some translations. Robert Schuller wrote a book about the Beatitudes called The Be Happy Attitude. And he argued for you to translate that word. Happy are those. It's not without precedent. If you read the first Psalm, happy are those who follow the path. And, you know, it's not he didn't make it up. Someone else, and this gets close to what you were saying, someone else arguing should be fortunate are those. Fortunate. Think about Lady Fortune. Think about the word fortune. Fortunate mean. It's a word that on the one side sounds very religious, like these are gifts from God, and on the other side can sound very, very pagan, like this is fortune. This is luck. And there's one author, one New Testament scholar that argues that the word comes out of the honor and shame continuum. So we should be translating it, how honorable are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. How honorable are those who weep. That kind of. So I guess what I'm saying, Cindy, is I think we have a poverty of language when it comes to naming something that really does give us tremendous benefit, for which we are grateful recipients, not necessarily the masters of our own provision here, and might have a horrible history behind it that we find regrettable. Nonetheless, it feeds us and helps. It's hard to find language for that. So I don't know. I guess we're all just trying the best we can to deal with so much of life that's given to us. Yes, Sue.
I've also heard less used very sarcastically. Bless your heart. When you know that isn't exactly the sentiment involved.
Yeah. Now, don't make fun of Southerners now. Yeah. You're right. That's a phrase that means, oh, my goodness, they don't know what they're doing. Yeah. Yeah. Bless their heart. Bless their heart. Now, I many of the matriarchs in my family meant that every time they said it. They meant it in the most affectionate, but I feel sorry for you way. So yeah, that's an interesting use. Don?
Well, you know, the phrase "blessed are the poor." I basically had a happy childhood, but I grew up in a poor family. And the thing of it is, I never felt poor. My family never talked about us being poor. All we talked about was how broke we were. We weren't poor, we were just broke. And so the answer to our poorness had to come with, so my dad said, okay, as soon as you can get a paper route, you know, you can start buying these little treats you want, but don't ask me because I'm broke. You know, and so Christmas became new pajamas and new underwear and t-shirt. They were things of utility, and those made us happy. And so I said, I grew up in a happy home, but when I reflect on it now, it was a poor household I grew up in, but I didn't feel downtrodden, just didn't have any money. Neither did my folks. So it just put a whole different perspective. So when I married Lynn and her family,
Oh,
my
boy, did Tony
baby's
Lynn
first
over there.
mistake was in my first wedding. I gave her a bathroom cleaner for Christmas. Because we didn't have one in the house we were living in. And her folks sort of, that's not a proper Christmas present. So, you know, you live and learn and you change your lifestyle, but still, so, you know, I just want to always keep that in my mind. Stop right there.
Yeah, we're all thinking, bless his heart. Yeah. But, you know, I mean, that's a great, poverty obviously is a relative, right? And if you're in a place that's relatively poor, but everybody is, and you don't necessarily see yourself as poor, but broke. I think that's a great, great distinction there. In Jesus' day, some of the things we want to remember about the gospel story is that there had been a concentration of wealth that had moved from the countryside, the small villages, which is where Jesus spent most of his time in Galilee, into the city and the coast. This was part of the Roman imperial occupation. Fishers like Peter and James, John, and all of them were typically part of a guild, and they had to be part of a guild because that's the only way you can survive, because a significant part of your catch and your profit went straight to different arms of the empire, and you needed each other to depend on one another, to help each other when your ship or your boat has troubles and your nets are broken, something like that. Most of the crowd that's mentioned so often in the Gospels are people who have been pretty systematically impoverished by the Roman Empire. And so just think the difference between the Old Testament context in, say, the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and the New Testament context in the Gospel. In Leviticus, if you owned property, you couldn't buy the property next door when your neighbor had fallen into debt. Maybe they had a bad crop or something for a number of years, fallen into debt. You couldn't buy that property and keep it. You could buy it, but every 7 years you had to give it back, because that was their family land. It wasn't just their cash crop. That was where their families were born and bred and lived. If someone were indebted to you, and Eric makes reference to this in the chapter, gave you their cloak as a surety for their debt, at night, you had to go give it back. Because you don't know, that might be the only blanket they have. There's one place where the prophet, I can't remember if it's Amos or Micah, criticizes people for selling the sweepings of the wheat. And that's a weird phrase. It gets sometimes translated very differently from that. But remember, back in Leviticus, if you owned property and you're harvesting your wheat and you drop a sheep, you're not allowed to go back and pick it up, because there are landless people to whom that belongs, right? So you have all of these laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that make it impossible to read. But they're economic law that recognize that in order for a family to have a chance at surviving, they need property, and that's why you have all these marital laws, that the property goes to this family, not that family. The property can't be divided over and over and over again, or else it'll become too small to sustain anybody. All of those things were very important during the Old Testament time. By the New Testament, all of that was out the window. If you look at Jesus' parables, it's a landowner and the workers. The workers are the many poor who used to live on this land. And now at best, they're tenant farmers, and at worst, they're simply laborers for some absentee landlord who is a favorite of the empire and has been awarded with land for their favor. So when you get to the New Testament, they had moved radically far away from the kind of ideals that had been embraced in the Old Testament. And so faithful people are asking a real difficult question. And I want you to hear this, because this is our difficult question. Faithful people are asking the difficult question in a system that is so far removed from God's will, in a system that is just built on injustice, a system that we didn't create, we are just born into it, a system that is askew. How do you please God? How do you live as God's people? I think this really gets illustrated toward the end of Mark, when Jesus at one point is criticizing the chief priests, Pharisees, for, among other things, really gouging widows, right? They were supposed to support them, and they're not. And the story that happens right after that is the story of the widow with the 2 mites, the 2 pennies. And we always talk about the widow's mite and how heroic she was. And indeed, Jesus said she's giving more than all these folks with bags of gold, because she's giving out of her poverty, right? She's giving significant. She's also contributing to the very system that oppresses her. It's not an accident that these 2 stories are kind of side by side. Jesus criticizes a system that's supposed to support, but instead oppresses, and at the same time recognizes her heroism in a screwed up system. And a lot of what we read in the New Testament, I think we would read more profitably if we see that Jesus is talking to people in a broken system. And this is all about how do you attain some measure of righteousness, justice, faithfulness, compassion in a system that is broken so severely. And I see Eric getting there with this chapter as well, right? He could have taken this chapter in a very different direction. And I don't know if he chose the right direction or not. The affirmation number 6 is basically a restatement of what a lot of people call liberation theology. And it's a theology that came to us out of the lived context of the poor in Latin America and South America. And it had been rejected by a lot of the more European American and European Christian, but it is built on the principle. This came from the Bogota Declaration, that God takes sides, and God is on the side of the poor. And of course, wealthy white churches, witness, wealthy white churches pushed back on that theology a lot. The sixth affirmation essentially is a proclamation of liberation theology. So Eric could have gone that direction and talked about, Gutierrez, Leonardo Boff, and some of the other great Latino theologians. But instead, he talked about where we are and the fact that you have a woman who can't get a job because of her debts, right? And how you want to point to the people who aren't hiring her and say, Dad, you should do better. But then he tries to take a sympathetic look to the CEO of the company. And if there's a possibility that 1% of the folks are, doing internal thieving or something like that, then he's going to have to answer to his board of directors if he doesn't start some process like don't hire someone with bad credit. So, remember Sunday, we read from Amos. The first part of Amos was, it would be like a man who ran from a bear into the mouth of the lion, and then went into the home and laid his hand against the wall and was bitten by the asp or the snake. Do you remember that part? It's an eminently forgettable part, but it's hilarious and it's true. You run from the roar, let's say you run from the roar of the lion this way, and suddenly there's a bear. And so you run from the bear, you finally make it home and you're exhausted and you put your hand on the wall and you get bitten by a snake. And that's exactly how this woman in this chapter feels about life. She can't go this way because she has debt. So she goes that way and it's even worse. And she goes this way and she finally thinks, okay, I've got a path. I'm going to get a job and I'm just going to work down this $10,000 debt little by little and be able to kind of get back on top of things. And she gets bitten by the asp because she can't get a job with her credit. It's one of the most underrated parts of Scripture because it names the tragic nature of poverty and how every possible avenue seems to have one more roadblock that you can't take. Now that's very contrary to the American ideal of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, right? And it's just a matter of working hard and being serious about it. Those are values we want to drill into our children and our grandchildren and so forth, but that doesn't answer the question in a context, a situation that's tragic. And that's what Amos is trying to address there. And I feel like that's what Eric's trying to address. Yes.
I don't know if this is related, but when I was reading this week, it was interesting to me because I had a conversation with my daughter on the phone, and she was telling me that she and Lisa were buying a new sofa, and they had researched and found something online they liked, and they went into the store to check it out. And she said the salesperson said to them, if you don't mind, if you're going to buy this sofa, please buy it through us. Because she said so much is being ordered online. She says that our store may not make it. Now, for me, I'm thinking, I can remember as a young person, I lived in farm towns, and I can remember women saying, I wish we lived closer to town so I could get into the stores, and I didn't have to make anything.
Right.
So I'm thinking from there to here, here we have stores now that employ people, like the woman who needs to work, the people, and yet people are picking up their phones and ordering it online, and those stores may disappear. It's like, you know, for me, it's kind of like we've forgotten, like for this woman, how important each person is, that they should be allowed to have a job. And if we takes a little extra time for us to go in the store. But I don't know why that came to me while I was reading about this woman. You know, it's
right.
It's what do you call it, a weird thing?
Well, I don't know if it's a weird thing. I mean, it's all part of a process, right? Because once upon a time, the Target that my kids bypassed by ordering everything on Amazon, the Target came into town, and suddenly the Ben Franklin store couldn't survive it. And once upon a time, Ben Franklin store came into town, and there was a dry goods store that only sold dry goods that is no longer viable. You know what I mean? There is something about our system of constant innovation and expansion, going from the local mom and pop shop to the superstore and now the virtual store. That is what Joseph Schumpeter called the process of creative destruction. It destroys as it creates. And maybe the question is, you know, can it create? Can we envision a process of creative destruction that can still be just? And I think that's the challenge that faces us. Betty said, and she might have said this quite some time ago, reminds me of a study, perhaps by Harvard, on overcoming generational poverty. It takes 20 years of good luck to overcome generational poverty. I heard yesterday, in the last 24 hours, I've spent 8 of them in meetings with different homeless organizations here in town. And someone said the number one indicator of potential homelessness is past homelessness. Think about that. That's another way of talking about generational, how hard it is to establish a different platform from which to live. If perhaps as a child, all you've known is homelessness or moving from foster care to foster care or something like that. So yeah, I think the generational nature of this stuff. But let me just point to what Eric says on page 68, and then and he finishes the thought on page 70. At the end of that first full paragraph, he says, what is particularly troubling about that is that these injustices are not generally created by evil people who care nothing for God or that everyday person, but by good people trapped in a corrupting system. And then he goes on to talk about, imagine you're the CEO of this company and all the pressures that you have. So what we're talking about is structural injustice, not, you know, something we can attribute to the bad guy in the black hat or, you know, the evil person. And then on page 70, at the beginning of the second full paragraph, he said, in this climate, we do have something to fear. When the entire system is corrupt, we can no longer hope for personal transformation to solve our problem. The system itself must change. That is probably as anti-American as one can imagine.
It's true.
Because the phrase personal responsibility, the notion that each of us is captain of our own ship, that has been drilled into every one of us from childhood by textbooks and television shows and all those kinds of things. And by church, because it's more than just getting saved. A church that's all about making sure you get saved, so that by the time you go to heaven, by the time you die, you go to heaven. And I hope that when we die, we all go to heaven. Let's get together. Let's talk about these things from the other side and laugh at our ignorance. Let's promise to do that. I want that to happen. And I fully expect to find you all there. But the church is about more than that personal transformation, making sure each of us squeak through the pearly gate. The church is about now. And that's why the explanation of the affirmation is that we recognize this is both a spiritual and a material issue. And the church needs to be about justice, not just salvation. And my evangelical friends have a hard time wrapping their head around it. They feel like justice is just, do the best you can, but just hold your breath, because in the end, we're all going to be in heaven. It'll be fine. Just make sure that you're safe. And that's when I want to go back and read what Amos said in our text last week. I despise your rituals, your feasts, your psalms, your sacrifices. That's what churches major in. And God says, I hate those things, because there's no justice rolling down like mighty waters. And this is the blood of justice. It's not just a trickle. And we seem to think the best we're going to get is a trickle. And God is calling for just a devastating flood of justice. So it does seem to me that unless our righteousness focuses on the systems in which we live, not just personal transformation, that we're missing the point of the gospel. Jesus would never have been put to death either by the synagogue leaders or the Roman imperialists if all he's talking about is making you a nicer person who prays more and follows the commandments better. If that doesn't get you killed. Cindy, you had your hand.
It was this.
Oh, Cindy. Thank you for thinking. Sorry. Sue, you had your hand.
This whole chapter made me think of homelessness.
Yes.
And just recently, the system has only made that worse, as far as I'm concerned. I think the Supreme Court has made it more difficult. And now for a person who's homeless because they are poor, have no money, if you find them and you put them in jail, you're only making life more difficult for them instead of trying to do something to help. It just seems to me appalling.
I fully agree.
There are lots of things that are appalling.
That's the latest appalling. Yeah, hard to name.
Last Wednesday night on Zoom, you mentioned something that you had met, and someone had said to you, 30%. It's been on my mind ever since you said that. I could tell you were very upset, concerned about that statement. That 30% of the people don't want to be sheltered or put somewhere, and you were very upset about that.
Yeah. Was that Wednesday in this meeting, or
no,
it was on Zoom?
Night.
All right. Yeah. So I was at a thank you event for a lot of the apartment managers who have started to work with us at United in Homelessness to make units available for us. And there was one person I met there, and she attributed this to Jim Palmer, who is a former head of the Orange County. Who said that? What is it?
Rescue mission.
Yeah, the Orange County Rescue Mission. And she said, Jim Palmer told us that 30% of homeless people don't want housing. And I said, Jim Palmer told you wrong. They may not want to go live in a shelter, because for a lot of people, life in a shelter is hard. I mean, you have to keep your possessions with you, you have to keep your children with you. You don't know what the other people are going to be like. It's hard life. My son is a chef at a shelter, and you know, he will tell you that there are some very difficult personalities there. He's dedicated to the fact that they need shelter. A lot of people would rather take their chances in a tent, or, you know, finding some little compartment to sleep than to be in a shelter. But when you approach people who are homeless about a home, that's a different answer. It's not 30% of them saying, I'd rather live out here. Just think, you don't get a good night's sleep. You never know whether you're going to be roused up and told to move on. You have to have all your possessions in something that you can cart around, because you have to keep moving. If you look at how weathered people are who are homeless, they don't have a home, and the answer is a house, right? Anyway, so yeah, it was maddening to hear that, because what that tried to do is to take a housing market in Orange County, which is ridiculously out of reach for too many people, and blame the folks who are not able to help them. It's that personal responsibility. And I think, look, I think responsibility is a great term, should always accompany the word blessing. But this is a very important point. Personal transformation, even personal responsibility in a broken system, is not the appropriate response to a broken system. And systemic work is hard, and it's political, and nothing makes people bare their teeth more than solutions that are going to take away some of their privilege. I had to say that. Sorry. And I'm among them. I think that. All right. Anybody else have a comment you wanted to share? So on 74, Eric kind of summarizes his reading of Amos, which I thought was, his PhD is in Old Testament, and I think it shows in this chapter. With that first full paragraph, what God is saying is, despite all of Israel's good religious practices, the festivals to Yahweh, the offering to Yahweh, the songs of praise to Yahweh, and so on, they might as well be worshiping the astral deity if there's no justice in the land for the poor and the disenfranchised. That's a really interesting explanation of verses 21 through 27. I think it's pretty accurate. Amos is using some sarcastic language there. And you know me, I love sarcasm. Okay, what else do we need to say here? Yes.
I think we're in a pickle. I think it's hard to figure out what to do on a daily basis.
It is.
Whether you go to the farmer's market or not, or whether you know, because the second you said that, I thought, well, if I stop buying canned goods or frozen stuff, what happens to people in the factory? We're seeing this massive movement to online and stores closing. So it almost feels like, I'm not sure what the right answer is. I'm not sure there is a right answer.
Right. I like your second comment a little bit better.
Yeah. I feel very like, do I do this? Do I do that? I don't know. Well,
it's the nature of being human. You won't survive unless you eat something that used to be living. It could be an animal product, it could be a plant product, right? That's part of the tragic nature of human life. So let me get Val's comment, and then we'll circle back to how do we move forward in a tragic world.
Okay, so I was going to just say that his solution is walking the talk when like ridiculous. I wish we had more ideas of things we could do, but I do think we do have personal responsibility. I'm going to say an example I did a few days ago, last week. Went to Whole Foods and Mother's Market. I was going to buy flowers, and I didn't know where they came from. So I asked, like, where do the flowers come from? And they like didn't know. And I said, oh, I'm really concerned because I don't buy flowers unless it's from the United States because it's a crop, you know, pesticides and all that. And it got into a big discussion, and the produce people came over, and then the manager came over, and they had never thought of it. So it's like this tiny little thing.
Yeah, that's
and
great.
Then they all ended up going, oh, we're going to talk to the district manager. And then I was in there yesterday, and they said, we haven't got it, but we did talk to our buyer. They're looking for a new buyer for Mother's Market to buy their flowers. And
look
it's like,
at you, Val,
oh
fighting the fight.
Because it just like it never had occurred to them that flowers are a crop. It's like, oh, we all know that. So I think like personal responsibility or housing, we can go to city council and we can be, so you know, they hate the city. And we can work for that. So I think like it's systemic. Right. It seems hopeless, but it shouldn't be hopeless because we still have that responsibility.
Right.
And we have white privilege. Our voice goes far.
Yeah. So I came out of this chapter, you know, not totally despairing. It's easy for me to be totally despairing these days. I just have to say. But I think the word personal responsibility, the phrase personal responsibility, is interesting. You know, you and I, we can only see the world through our eyes.
Sure.
Right? I can't see the world through your eye. I can hear your story. So we have a gift, a blessing, let's call it, of empathy, where we can hear someone else's story as our own, loving our neighbor as ourselves. All right, that's that expansive motion that this is all part of. So number one, we can hear other story with empathy, and not just the story of people who look like us and live like us, but particularly, as Jesus did, the stories and the struggles of people who are not like us. So personal responsibility number one is to expand our repertoire of stories that we can hear and listen to them empathetically, right? Loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, hearing our neighbor's story as we hear our own. Number two is to be frank and honest that we are living within a tragic situation. I want to use that word in its real sense, right? It doesn't mean we're all going to die tomorrow. It just means the context itself has built into it some very destructive things that end up really harming people's lives. An unjust situation. So where can we turn for some guidance? If you like reading, Reinhold Niebuhr probably is the 20th century theologian that gave this some of the most sustained thought. He's got one book called Moral Man. Sorry for the language. This was in the 50s. Moral Man in Immoral Society. Think about that. The person trying to do good in a society that has other values. He wrote a lot about the word tragedy and taking that seriously. What it means to live in a tragic situation. I think our theology can be really helpful to us here, because at the center of our theology is the cross. It's not unicorns and bubbles. This is a radically honest story of what happens when the Christ comes into the human context. And what happens is he's put to death. But what also happens is that's not the last word. So you and I, through the drama of the cross and resurrection, we have a path for being honest, and knowing that is not going to resolve itself in a short time like a superhero movie. It's not going to resolve itself necessarily to a happy ending. But the arc of the universe bends toward justice. That's a way of thinking about being a moral person in an immoral context. So yeah, there's personal responsibility, but we also have the gifts of empathy, and we have the responsibility of choosing whose story we will give priority. I don't care if Elon Musk moves to Texas. I don't necessarily want all the people I know who work for SpaceX and all of that to leave. But this pampered child, that's not the story of the oppressed. No matter how much he wants to pretend that Californian oppression is driving him away. Whose story are we listening to? His story is on page 6 of the LA Times. His story is in the New York Times update today. His story. He hasn't even moved. He's just threatening to move, right? His story gets that. Why? Because he's wealthy, he's famous, he's all the things that wealth brings you. That's not the story that I'm going to pay attention to with empathy and to be transformed. I'm going to choose to listen to other stories. And I'm going to do that because while God loves everybody, God's on the side of the oppressed. That's the hard part of this chapter. We want to say all lives matter to God. And in fact, Jesus took side. Doesn't mean God didn't love Herod. Jesus didn't love Herod. But Jesus wasn't going to put up with Herod's stuff. Not at all. And you and I, if anything, that's where our personal responsibility comes in. With whose story are we going to empathize? To whose story are we going to listen? I want to read a couple more things that are online. Beryl says, I read that a big factor in stopping further building of public housing in the U.S. was the Real Estate Association. It is a mixed bag with the Real Estate Association. On the one hand, they want to make money. And they make money by building $2 million homes, not affordable homes. In that sense, they're very little different from the rest of us because we're trying to maximize our businesses and our earning as well. At the same time, there lies the problem, right? So, I do think they have been a big part of the conversation, but I'm going to save that conversation for another time. All right. Any last comments you want to make before we finally recognize that it's 11:03? Every week after this meeting, I go back to my office and I tell Sue Ann on the way, I talked too much. I just need to talk less. And every week I violate that again. So just with due apology, let's say thank you, everybody. We'll pick it up again next week. I think number 8